I want to thank the organizers of the conference very much for the invitation to speak at such an important conference. I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. I'd very much like to see the show, and I hope that the conversations that you have are valuable and wonderful. Today, although I would normally speak about Talbot and science and the history of photography, today I wanted to talk about something that I feel is very important to not only photographic history, but especially to Talbot studies, and that is the slow formation of digital Talbot, a sort of network of digital sources that help us work on Talbot studies, and to talk a little bit about what it might mean and where I think we might be going in the future, and hopefully it will stimulate some conversation, maybe introduce you to some things you didn't already know, but probably you do. In 2003, the correspondence of William Henry Fox Talbot went live. It was a project long in the making, appearing almost a decade after Larry Schaff's first printed version of the selected correspondence of William Henry Fox Talbot, 1823 to 1874. Here I show you the front cover of that, which was published by the Science Museum, edited by Larry Schaff, and incorporated in it a hand list that had been made earlier by the librarian Christine. It was followed just a year later with a more complete draft calendar. And here I show you the draft calendar. It's clipped off the web. I'm sorry, it's not a very good photograph of it. The electronic correspondence, which was just under 10,000 letters at the time of publishing and slightly over that number now, took 4 years and a team of editors and translators, administrators, and web content managers. And here I should state the disclaimer that, in fact, I was one of those assistant editors as a doctoral student working on the project for 3 years between 2000 and 2003. The online publication of the correspondence was a watershed in the field of photographic history, and as it's fast approaching its 50th birthday, which is, digitally speaking, quite an ancient age, it seems appropriate to take a close look at how it's formed an important point of reference in an expanding network of digital photographic history sources in general, of course, and digital Talbot sources in particular. In a field as young as photographic history, the digital correspondence played perhaps an outsized role as a new technology. But it's not a technology that we should claim, quote-unquote, changed everything, nor is it one that's merely a servant of scholarly searching. Like Bruno Latour, I feel that these Talbot technologies are not just digital platforms that are created by users of Talbot materials, but that they have themselves created more users and also created more digital technologies. In this short presentation, I want to discuss the ways in which we could view the creation and networking of a digital Talbot, and the ways in which the digital presence of Talbot changes the nature of future projects and of scholarship. Far too much has been written about digital scholarship to sum it all up here in a short 20-minute paper, and much of it you know anyway. The slow movement of information online very often mirrors at first the analog scholarship. That is, the first online projects, many projects since those first online projects, put online the things that already existed in libraries. But even just the shift from analog to digital tells us something about the effects on the field. For instance, it's really no surprise that one of the first digital resources in photographic history should be a letters project. It follows the lead of previous projects that started decades before, like the Darwin and the Faraday correspondence. Taking Talbot correspondence online, though, can show us a shift in the funding streams of such projects. The first and smallest publication of Talbot's letters was initiated through the Science Museum, whose collection of Talbot material warranted special attention. It still does. The second iteration of the correspondence, published by Glasgow University Library, signaled this move of the project away from the museum collections and toward the universities. At that time, and the shift also opened the project up to a very different sort of funding stream, since university departments in the arts and humanities were funded through the Arts and Humanities Research Board, now the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC. The digital correspondence moved the publishing of the correspondence from the museum sphere into the university. Larry Schaff recounted to me that he was appointed research professor in art history at the University of Glasgow in 1995 in order to get the correspondence off the ground. I'm deeply indebted for a long email correspondence with Larry Schaff in February of this year for this information. It goes back, way back. In 1999, with this institutional base at Glasgow University, the British Academy then funded, he was able to obtain British Academy funding for 1 year of editing and the building of a basic website to hold the databases. Then the Arts and Humanities Research Board funded a further 3 years to see it through to publication. And while some of this outcome, taking the Talbot correspondence all the way from its preliminary correspondence to the letters, can be put down to Larry Schaff's unquenchable enthusiasm for photographic history and for Talbot and his circle in particular. There's another network that's worthy of our attention if we are to consider a digital Talbot. And this is the network in Britain, anyway, of institutional patronage and national funding agencies. I think funding is important to watch because digital projects require enormous amounts of funding, very often long periods of very large teams of people to get them online. Stating the obvious here, everyone already knows this, but I think as scholars we very often don't talk about the effects of requiring that kind of funding on the kind of scholarship that we do. Aside from just mapping the funding, it's important to understand how that funding attracts more funding. We all know one small grant might lead to the next grant, etc., etc. And each successful project makes it likelier that the next project will be funded, and that more projects that arrive online successfully, the more scholars think that such projects are both possible and useful. The relationship between the draft calendar of correspondence of 1995 and the online correspondence of 2003 is very close, and it is a case of trying to put something online, enhance something, and put it online. So the description of the calendar states that it lists nearly 10,000 letters, describes the correspondence, the dates, the addresses, and crucially for Talbot's very widespread collection across many institutions, it tells us where the collections are that hold each item. And that's was a very important characteristic for finding Talbot letters. It's also a fairly typical organization for a draft calendar of letters. It's a very close approximation of what the online correspondence also promised. So far, it may seem like many of the print structures of the Letters Project are repeated in the online version, but I want to argue that there are differences that are quite important to the formation of a digital Talbot. And these two crucial differences are the whole text aspect of the letters, that's the whole text being in the searchable online edition, and also its searchability, the mere fact that you can search it and organize it in different ways. Correspondence calendars are naturally not complete. They're merely lists of letters without any or with very little content of the letter itself. Some editions, like the correspondence of Sir John Herschel, attempted to sum up the most important part of each letter, a practice that is, if possible, even more frustrating than the lack of any letter content. The advantage of releasing the entire letter is, of course, that you capture much more potential information, again, stating the obvious. The disadvantage is that the sheer volume of that capture of all of the information makes it much more difficult to search. At this point, the search tools that become available for the online correspondence becomes critically important. These two aspects of the online correspondence resonate through Talbot studies and have given rise to a number of interesting terms in scholarship. But before I get to that, it's maybe important to understand what other digital sources have come to photographic history outside Talbot studies. In 2012, the correspondence and papers of Joseph von Niepce were published. Bringing together the research from over a decade of this important inventor, and it follows a very similar pattern to the Talbot correspondence. That is, there were several books, many editions of letters that were written, and of correspondence, and of documents, before they were then put online. And it's a constantly improving website. In 2013, Roger Fenton's Crimean Letter Books was republished. So it was originally published in 2005, and it was republished in 2013. This particular project goes one step further to publishing texts. It links two letter books, one in the National Science and Media Museum, Bradford, and the other in the Harry Ransom Humanities Research Center in Austin, Texas. But once it puts those two letter books together, it also links outward to another fantastic resource that since 2005 has come online, and that is the Library of Congress's digitization projects of its photographic holdings. They happen to have digitized most of Roger Fenton's Crimean photographs, and it was possible to link mentions of people and places and taking of views to suggestions in the online images. So from Roger Fenton's Crimean letter books, you could read what he has to say, but you can also look at some of the photographs that may have been taken at or near the places that he's mentioned. This online project brings much closer together the written textual sources that we have in photographic history with those visual sources that are rapidly coming online. And another project, also run in part out of the Library of Congress materials and hosted by Yale University, is Photographic, which brings together the FSA photographs that are held in the Library of Congress, as well as the textual documents in organizing the Farm Security Administration and the photographic unit that were photographing all over the states, and puts together things like mapping tools, ways of searching the FSA photographs that we haven't had yet. And it already has overturned quite a lot of the scholarship in this particular area of photographic history. And these are interesting combinations of universities working together with archives to create something new that changes scholarship. And I'll come to that again in the end. Just weeks ago, the University of Zurich and Heidelberg University libraries put online a complete and searchable edition of Camera Work, the photographic quarterly that we all know and love. It is now a usable site that you can go in and you can word search all of the articles and look for all of the images. Everything's been put online at the University of Heidelberg Library. They are one of the forerunners of digitization projects in Germany, and they have many other digital library resources. This is the first large photographic one that I'm aware of that they have done, and it's fantastic. I recommend it. And there are certainly more projects going online. There are many that I haven't mentioned, and it doesn't even begin to account for the collections that have begun putting their collections online and digitizing them, which are a huge and valuable resource for any kind of scholarship. But what are they doing to scholarship? And what about digital Talbot scholarship in particular? One of the important forces that the digital has made in the drive is this drive towards comprehensibility. It's no longer good enough to have excerpts or lists or anything less than the whole piece of information. We're becoming accustomed to it and expectant of finding more in the everyday details of Talbot's life and in his complete writings. Some years ago, the full text of Penciled Nature went online for everyone to study. Now, the early volumes have been quite well studied. They're not quite as rare. They exist in more collections. Excuse me. The online edition has allowed scholars to study the last few volumes as closely as the first 5. Several years ago, Miriam Brusius, who I know is sitting in the audience, hello Miriam, cataloged the Talbot notebooks in the British Library. Now, these notebooks, and Miriam has written this in many places, Talbot was a prolific writer, and he had a huge output of letters and notebooks. And this vast amount of writing is really matched by his prolific output of photographs and photomechanical engravings. In the British Library notebooks, the possibilities for Talbot scholarship seem to be about endless. There's printed material, notebooks, legal and financial material, herbaria, calling cards, poetry, mathematics, and more. In 2017, and I want to say that, I'll get back to that in a moment. In 2017, then, the Talbot Catalogue Raisonné went live at the Bodleian Library, and with several thousand images up, its aim is to publish 25,000 photographs by Talbot, dwarfing the correspondence. It is the product of 20 years of research by Mary Schaff, and again, a team of web programmers and research assistants. It's the perfect example of making research data from a lifetime of work open to the public to carry on further work. Although there may be problems with any or even all of these digital sources, what I want to discuss is not their shortcomings. Each of them has shortcomings. Nothing is perfect in the world, but the possibilities for further scholarship are something is the area that I want to stay with. What does all this digitization of Talbot cause to happen, and what's it all good for? Are we producing new scholarship, or are we just repeating ourselves using new and more expensive tools? I would like to argue that digital Talbot is indeed causing us to do new research and consider new things. In part, it is because it has often been a good correction to our expectations by highlighting the shortcomings of previous selection by editors, by scholars, by curators, and so forth. In such a great mass of material, Talbot has in particular been subject to reading by various individuals, selecting texts or images by those who've had access to them. Each selection has newly reinforced entrenched narratives about Talbot as a scientist or Talbot as an artist, eliding the richness of the world in which he wrote and made images. Miriam Brusius and Chitra Ramalingam have made that abundantly clear in their brilliant book on Talbot Beyond Photography, where mathematics, botany, and cuneiform and more feature in this sort of rich kaleidoscope of scholarship about Talbot. Their book is a breakthrough and essential reading for anyone in the field who wants to understand Talbot's image making and his attitude towards photography. To close, I want to take on a different case, however, in showing how digital Talbot is making a difference. Take the case of Amelina Petit-Bouguer, governess to Talbot's half-sisters and longtime family friend. When the online correspondence was launched, it was easy to begin to see which correspondents were most prolific. Until this time, Amelina had never really figured except in Talbot's biography. But on looking at her letters, we have no less than 106 remaining letters. That's quite a few more than to other quote-unquote important people like Arago, Francois Arago, and so on. The subject matter of these letters is even more interesting. Now, the voices of governesses are not often heard in the larger machinery of history, and I would like to argue that the Talbot correspondence has, with its huge numbers of women correspondents, the possibility of changing all that. It spawned a transcription and translation of Amelina's notebooks and another website in which you can view Amelina's letters to Talbot, and you can also look at transcriptions and translations of her notebooks. Much of these new sources will be used for scholarship in the future. Amelina is now included in several books, like Joanna Martin's Wives and Daughters, as well as Amelina and the Talbots at Laycock. One might have expected that it would be of interest to scholars of the much understudied lives of women in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but something more important has happened with the opening out of correspondence between Henry Talbot and Amelina. Theirs was a really great friendship. He trusted her with some of his more adventurous plans, like trying to start a calotyping business in Paris in partnership with the capitalists, Hugh Anton Joseph Eugene Marais, the Marquis de Pisano. The story is so well known that it isn't necessary to tell you all. You all know it quite well, being Talbot scholars yourself. If not, I recommend Nancy Keeler's excellent article on the subject in the History of Photography. What's interesting is that Amelina was his main correspondent. And we have very few letters directly from Marais to Talbot, interestingly. And these letters, most of the correspondence about trying to set up the exchange, most of the advice was sent through Amelina, most of the meetings were arranged through Amelina, and she is the one who tells Talbot what's going on the ground in Paris when they're trying to start this up. What becomes possible when you have a digital Talbot is to give depth to this correspondence that we already have. For instance, Marais was eventually disillusioned and he gave up the partnership after finding the calotype too unwieldy for commercial benefit. In one letter of 26th of July, 1843, Talbot writes back to him with an evaluation of several images. It's now possible to find some of the images in the catalogue des May. And here I show you two of the above-mentioned bust of Minerva, the negative and one print. What's possible with the new sources is to bring the comparison of Talbot's critique to the images. And here I overlay the letter transcription so that you can see that number 6, statue of Minerva on photogenic paper. The picture is very striking, says Talbot. This is a translation of the original French. It seems that the time of day was chosen very carefully for taking this object. It's interesting that Talbot was very interested in the shadows on this object. And he does say that these three pictures, number 11 to 6, bizarrely, are the only ones that are worthy of being displayed in public. Now, this rather clunky exercise that I've done requires that we use two different sources, the online correspondence and the catalogue des May, and that we overlay them into a single PowerPoint slide. It didn't happen in a single search, but because I happen to know that the images are in the database, and I also happen to know to search for them. I also know that this letter exists, and I know to look for it and who to look for it under to find it very quickly. But the possibilities of linking the searches to cause these two items to be returned in a single search is perhaps a very suggestive one and a possible future for the notion of digital Talbot. I, of course, would advocate for opening up much wider and trying to bring together two types or very different types of sources, that is, written letters, images, notebooks, and so on, into one platform so that we can begin to understand the linkage between these various projects at the British Library, at the Bodleian Library, and the online correspondence at DMU. The various efforts to digitize Talbot sources over the last 15 years has given Talbot studies a digital presence without compare. Digital Talbot has so far given us a rapidly expanding set of sources from which to work, no matter where we are in the world, and an introduction to the resources for students entering the field. It has networked us as scholars and consolidated Talbot studies as an international field of research, opening up what once was the preserve of only those with contact and access to the collections. It's allowed us to read against the grain of the archive and to understand that Talbot studies is not only the study of Talbot, but the study of a great number of histories, of landed gentry, of scientific endeavor, of mathematics, of the business of running an estate, of women, and of many other topics that exceed photography, and indeed exceed Talbot himself. This has in turn led to the use of this digital Talbot network by scholars in very many disciplines. The rapid expansion of scholars joining the field can only lead to more and better research as we go forward from here. I want to thank you very much for your time and patience, and especially for the slightly poor quality of the audio on this recording. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.